All right, buckle up, everyone, because today's deep dive is going to take us down a fascinating path.
Uh-oh, sounds intriguing.
We're going to explore Donald Trump's inauguration and policies, but from a totally unique perspective, a Christian viewpoint.
Okay, I'm listening.
We've got analyses of Trump's inauguration speech, a look at his Mars initiative,
Oh, well.
and even some explorations of biblical prophecy related to current events.
So, like, are we talking end time stuff here?
Yeah, we might touch on that. Get ready to unpack some unexpected connections between politics and Christian beliefs.
This should be good. I mean, just thinking about how different worldviews can shape interpretations of events, especially big ones like a presidential inauguration, that's fascinating to me.
Right, okay, so picture this. January 2017, Trump takes the oath, ends with that, "So help me God."
Yeah.
Then Franklin Graham gives a prayer, thanking God for saving Trump's life and raising him up.
Wow, okay, so right away it's framed through this lens of divine intervention. Like, it's not just politics, it's almost destiny. That's super interesting.
And that sets the stage for how the speaker interprets everything else.
Makes sense. Sets the tone, right?
Totally. And this America First theme in Trump's speech, the speaker actually likes that idea, but they add a twist.
Okay, what's the twist?
They say, yeah, make America strong, but a real Christian leader should prioritize God first.
So what does that even mean in politics? God first. Like, different policies.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you think, can you even separate faith and politics, especially for someone with such strong religious beliefs?
A debate that's raged for centuries. But in this case, this God first lens is shaping how the speaker sees all of Trump's policies.
So let's talk policy. The sources touch on border security, law and order, free speech, all seen through this Christian lens.
Okay, yeah, give me some examples.
Like border security is necessary to protect the nation, kind of like putting your own house in order first.
Like a good shepherd protecting their flock, I guess.
But then how would that worldview actually impact immigration policy? Would it
Mhm.
mean stricter rules?
Good question. And is this interpretation common in Christianity or just this speaker's view?
There's definitely a range of views within Christianity, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
Then there's law and order, which the speaker connects to God being a God of justice.
So strong law enforcement equals fighting corruption and aligning the government with, like, God's will.
It's almost like earthly law is reflecting God's ultimate justice. But then where does forgiveness fit in?
Yeah, forgiveness and redemption, those are big in Christianity too. That's an interesting tension to think about. Where does criminal justice reform fit into all of this?
Right, good point. Now, free speech is really important to the speaker.
In what way?
They see it as absolutely crucial for sharing the gospel, and they're super worried about censorship online, like on Facebook and YouTube.
Ah, so it's like a spiritual battle. These online platforms are the new battleground.
Exactly. But then how does this speaker balance free speech with the harm from misinformation, especially about religion?
Especially online, where stuff spreads so fast. Tough question. Where's the line?
It's a tricky one, for sure. But is free speech always seen as a God-given right by Christians, or is that just this speaker's take?
That's a great question. And it highlights how even within one religion, there's lots of different viewpoints. Now, this speaker also gets into some potentially controversial stuff like social engineering and race.
Yeah, and they come at it from a specific angle, rejecting those policies that promote certain social agendas and pushing for this colorblind society based on merit, all based on their interpretation of biblical teachings, particularly about gender roles.
Interesting. So it's not just personal opinion, it's about aligning society with God's design.
Mhm.
But again, that's one interpretation, not a universal belief in Christianity.
Right, definitely. And it's clear the speaker's worldview impacts how they see everything, always looking for that connection to biblical principles.
And that leads us to their take on the end times. They've got some interesting ideas about how Trump's policies and what's happening globally right now could be connected to biblical prophecy.
I gotta admit, reading that part was kind of unsettling. The idea that current events are fulfilling ancient prophecies is both intriguing and a little scary.
Definitely makes you think. What I find interesting is how worried they are about increasing chaos and conflict in the world.
Yeah, like those biblical stories about the end times are happening right now.
But how do different Christian denominations usually approach these prophecies? Is there like a common view? Or is it all over the place like we're seeing here?
That's a good question to keep in mind as we keep exploring this perspective.
For sure.
This is already so fascinating. But before we go full on end times, let's talk about something a little different. Trump's Mars initiative.
Oh, okay, a change of pace.
Yeah. Now remember, this speaker is deeply rooted in biblical truth and the concept of eternity.
Right, right.
So while they acknowledge that going to Mars is a big deal, they're not exactly thrilled about it.
They even said, quote, "I don't really care about this." It's like earthly pursuits, even Mars, don't compare to their spiritual concerns.
And they're worried about the cost, saying the money could be better used for problems here on Earth.
Problems that fit their Christian values more, right?
Mhm.
It's about priorities, what matters most. And for this speaker, it's the eternal, not the temporary.
Such a different way of looking at things. Makes me wonder how Christians historically viewed scientific advancements and space exploration. Has there always been this tension between faith and science?
Another great question. We could spend a whole deep dive just on that. But let's go back to the inauguration, specifically something that really grabbed the speaker's attention: nonverbal cues.
Oh yeah, they were hyper-focused on facial expressions during the inauguration.
Like reading people's minds through their faces. They're convinced those little cues show the real reactions to Trump's words, not just what people say.
They even said 80% of communication is nonverbal. Like we should be
How?
paying more attention to what's not being said than what is.
80%. Wow. Is that a real statistic?
Well, the exact percentage is debatable. But the idea that nonverbal communication matters a lot, that's true. Think about it. Body language, tone of voice, those things can speak volumes, even subconsciously.
And sometimes they totally contradict what someone's saying out loud.
Yeah, exactly. Like a secret language we're not even aware of. And this speaker seems to be fluent in it.
They're analyzing everything.
Yeah.
The smiles of Trump supporters, the frowns of anyone who seems skeptical. It's like they're looking for those hidden messages behind the words.
Trying to decode the truth like a human lie detector. But are they really seeing things others miss? Or reading too much into it?
That's the big question. We're all influenced by our own biases,
Yeah.
right? So maybe they're seeing what they expect to see.
That's true. But even if we're cautious about the speaker's interpretations, they do remind us to pay attention to those nonverbal cues. Most of us probably don't think about them much, but they're definitely impacting how we interact.
For sure. Makes you think about communicating more mindfully, paying attention to how things are said and how people react, not just the words themselves. It's like we're getting a whole new level of understanding about human interaction.
It really is. And this focus on nonverbal communication fits with the speaker's bigger worldview, the sense that there's a spiritual dimension to everything.
Yeah, they're looking for signs and deeper meaning everywhere.
Exactly. Now, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, this idea of Trump's policies aligning with biblical principles. Let's break down some examples, like the speaker's thoughts on social engineering, which they see as going against biblical teachings.
Okay, yeah. So they see government policies promoting certain social agendas
Yeah.
as like going against God's plan for humanity. They're worried about things like race and gender identity and instead push for this colorblind society based on merit.
And they back this up with their understanding of the Bible, saying God made two genders, male and female, and anything that tries to blur those lines goes against that plan.
That's definitely a controversial stance, especially today. It makes you wonder how other Christian groups view these issues of gender identity and social justice. Is there one Christian viewpoint, or is it more complicated than that?
It's definitely more complicated. Even within Christianity, there are many different interpretations of the Bible. Some might agree with the speaker, others might have totally different views based on their understanding and experiences.
Exactly. There's not one Christian perspective, just like there's not one secular perspective. It's much more diverse than that.
This deep dive really highlights the importance of nuance. Even seemingly clear concepts like biblical principles can have so many interpretations. And those interpretations can really impact how people see the world and interact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it reminds us to be respectful, to listen to other points of view, especially when we're talking about sensitive topics like religion and politics.
For sure. It's clear that this speaker sees Trump's presidency through a very particular lens, one shaped by their belief in this spiritual warfare, and that we're living in a really significant time, maybe even close to the end times.
That's a really important point. It helps us understand why they're so focused on the little details, like those facial expressions or policies that might seem unrelated to their faith. They see it all as part of this huge cosmic narrative, this fight between good and evil playing out globally.
And they see Trump as a major player in that fight, not just a politician, but potentially a tool of God, someone who could shift the balance in this spiritual battle.
A perspective that can be inspiring, concerning, or both, depending on your own beliefs. But it shows how powerful faith can be in shaping how we see the world and what we do.
And it raises another question. How does this worldview affect how they see people who disagree with them, even within their own faith? Do they just think they're wrong, or are they on the wrong side of this spiritual battle?
A question we need to dig into more as we continue this deep dive. Understanding how they see their opponents is key to really grasping their worldview and how it influences their actions in politics and society.
Yeah, definitely something to explore further. I'm also wondering how the speaker's ideas about the end times shape how they see what's happening in the world today. Do they interpret every conflict, every natural disaster, as a sign that the end is near?
Great question. And that takes us into another really interesting part of this perspective, how they interpret prophecy and apply it to their understanding of the world. We'll need to look at that carefully and see how it affects their hopes, fears, and ultimately what they do in the world. It really is amazing how intertwined faith and politics become when seen through this lens. It's like they're seeing a whole spiritual dimension to these events that most people might just miss.
For sure. Speaking of seeing things others miss, remember the speaker's deep dive into nonverbal communication. They were basically a human lie detector, analyzing every little facial expression during Trump's inauguration.
Right. Like they were convinced those nonverbal cues reveal people's true thoughts, not just what they say. Remember that.
Yep.
80% of communication is nonverbal, they said. We should focus more on what's not said.
80%? Seriously, is there any actual science behind that number?
The exact percentage is debatable, but the idea that nonverbal communication is important, that's absolutely true. Think about it. Body language, your tone of voice, facial expressions, all those things communicate so much, sometimes even without us realizing it.
Right, and sometimes it goes totally against what someone's saying out loud.
Exactly. It's like a secret language, and this speaker seems to have mastered it.
They really do. They scrutinized everything. Smiles from Trump supporters, frowns from anyone who seemed less than thrilled. Like, they were looking for those hidden messages, the real story behind the words.
Trying to figure out what people really think, like a human lie detector. But the question is, were they actually seeing something others missed, or were they just reading too much into things?
That's a good point. We all have our own biases, right? So maybe they were seeing what they expected to see.
True, we can't rule that out. But even if we're careful about the speaker's interpretations, they do make a good point about paying attention to those nonverbal signals. I bet most people don't think about that much, but it affects how we interact all the time.
Definitely. It makes you think about being more mindful when you communicate, not just focusing on the words, but how they're said, how people react nonverbally. It's like a whole new level of understanding how people connect.
Totally agree. And, you know, this focus on nonverbal communication goes back to their bigger worldview, the idea that there's a spiritual dimension to everything, even the ordinary stuff.
Right. They're searching for signs, for a deeper meaning in every interaction.
Now, I want to go back to something we discussed earlier, the whole thing about Trump's policies aligning with biblical principles. I think it's worth looking at some specific examples, like what they said about social engineering, which they saw as against biblical teachings.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part. They basically saw government policies promoting certain social agendas as like completely opposing God's plan for humanity. They were worried about race and gender identity and wanted a colorblind society based on merit instead.
And they based this belief on their understanding of the Bible, saying God created two genders, male and female, period. Anything that tries to change that goes against that plan, in their view.
Which is a pretty controversial stance, especially these days. Makes you wonder how other Christian groups approach these complex topics, like gender identity and social justice. Is there one Christian view, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's definitely more nuanced. Even within Christianity, there are so many interpretations of the Bible. Some might agree with this speaker, but others might have completely different opinions based on their own understanding and their own life experiences.
Right, it's not as simple as saying this is the Christian view. It's much more diverse than that.
Exactly. It's not that straightforward. And this deep dive really shows how important it is to be nuanced, to recognize that even something like biblical principles can have a lot of different meanings, and those interpretations really affect how people see the world and how they treat each other.
Absolutely. And it reminds us to be respectful and to actually listen to other points of view, especially when we're talking about sensitive topics like religion and politics.
Definitely. You know, throughout all of this, it's clear that this speaker sees Trump's presidency in a very specific way, shaped by their belief in spiritual warfare and their conviction that we're living in a time of massive importance, maybe even nearing the end times.
Yes, that's a really important point to remember. It explains why they focus so much on the details, even seemingly small things like facial expressions or policies that don't seem directly related to faith. To them, it's all part of this huge cosmic story, this fight between good and evil playing out on a global scale.
And in their eyes, Trump plays a big part in that fight. He's not just a politician, he's a potential tool for God, someone who could change the course of this spiritual battle.
It's a perspective that can be inspiring to some, concerning to others, or maybe even both, depending on what you believe. But it shows just how powerful faith can be in shaping how we view the world and what we do in it.
It really does. And it raises another question. How does this worldview influence how they see people who disagree with them, even other Christians? Do they just think those people are wrong, or do they see them as being on the wrong side in this spiritual battle?
That's what we need to explore more as we keep going with this deep dive. Understanding how they view their opponents is key to understanding their worldview and how it affects their actions in politics and society.
I agree. It's an important piece of the puzzle. And I'm also wondering how this speaker's ideas about the end times affect how they interpret what's happening in the world today. Do they see every conflict, every natural disaster as a sign that the end is close?
You know, it's pretty amazing how this speaker sees practically everything through this lens of spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
Like they're constantly searching for signs of this cosmic battle happening all around us, even in everyday life.
Yeah, and that's something that really stood out to me, understanding that for them, it's not just about interpreting what happens. It's about actually taking part in what they believe is a fight for good. Their actions, their involvement in politics, even what they choose to focus on, it's all part of this bigger struggle.
So they're kind of living in two worlds at once, the everyday world and the spiritual world that's always there, influencing everything.
Exactly, and that can be a really powerful motivator, gives them purpose and direction, even when things get tough, because they believe they're fighting for something way bigger than themselves, something eternal.
I can see that. This unwavering belief in good ultimately defeating evil could definitely give you strength and resilience during difficult times. But I'm curious about how this worldview affects their view of people who have different beliefs, even within Christianity. Do they just see those who disagree with them as mistaken, or do they feel like those people are on the wrong side of the spiritual battle?
That's a really important question, and I think it gets to the core of how this worldview plays out in real relationships.
Hmm.
Based on what we've seen, it seems like there's a tension there. On one hand, they really want to share their understanding of truth with others, hoping to wake them up to what they see as the real nature of things.
So there's this element of wanting to bring people over to their side to convince them to see the world the same way.
Right. But at the same time, they know not everyone is going to agree with them. And in those cases, there seems to be a feeling of, I wouldn't say judgment, but maybe concern.
Concern that those who don't align with their worldview might be vulnerable to bad spiritual influences or that they're missing out on this deeper understanding of reality.
Exactly. It's not about condemning others. It's more about wanting to protect them from what they see as spiritual dangers. And it highlights the challenges of having productive conversations between people with different worldviews, especially when those worldviews have such strong implications for how people understand good and evil, right and wrong.
It makes you realize how important empathy and understanding are in those kinds of conversations. Even if you don't share someone's worldview, you can still acknowledge that their beliefs are sincere and try to find common ground, even if it's just a shared respect for human dignity and the right to have different perspectives.
Very well said. This deep dive has really emphasized for me how deeply our beliefs shape how we see the world, especially when it comes to events as complex and emotionally charged as a presidential election.
Absolutely. We've seen how the speaker's Christian worldview colored their interpretation of everything from Trump's inauguration speech and policies to their views on social issues and even space exploration. It's like they're always looking through a particular lens that changes how they see everything.
And even though we might not agree with everything they say, it's valuable to understand why they believe what they believe. It helps us see the world from their perspective, which can lead to empathy and maybe even open up new ways to talk to each other and understand one another.
This has definitely been a thought-provoking journey. We've gone deep into some pretty complex ideas, biblical prophecy, spiritual warfare, how we communicate, and the many different ways people interpret Christianity.
And we've seen how all those things come together to create a unique worldview, one that might challenge some of our own assumptions, but also gives us valuable insights into how faith can influence how we understand politics, society, and our place in the universe.
It's a good reminder that even in a world that often feels divided and polarized, there's always space for curiosity, empathy, and being open to learning for people who see things differently than we do.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. How might understanding this perspective, even if it's not your own, help you better understand the bigger political picture and the role that religious beliefs play in shaping our world today?
That's definitely a question worth some reflection. As we've seen, faith and politics intersect in complex, nuanced, and often very personal ways. And approaching those complexities with thoughtfulness and respect is key to fostering understanding and bridging the gaps that often divide us.
Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.